The water exploded, not with the violence of an attack, but with something far more unsettling recognition. The massive crocodile, over 4 meters of prehistoric power, launched itself toward the edge of the pool where a man stood waiting, arms open, as if greeting a beloved child returning home after years away. But this wasn't a child. This was one of nature's most perfect killing machines. And the man wasn't afraid. He was smiling, tears streaming down his face, because after 23 years, Pocho, his son, as he called him, still remembered him. This is not a fairy tale. This is not fiction. This happened. And what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between species, about love, about loyalty, and about the terrifying question that haunts us all. How far would you go for someone you love, even if that someone could kill you with a single movement? The man's name was Gilberto Shedden, though everyone called him Cheeto. A Costa Rican fisherman who became a millionaire through peculiar circumstances. He lived in a world most people couldn't comprehend, but his wealth meant nothing compared to what he shared with Pocho, because what happened between them defied every law of nature, every principle of animal behavior, every boundary science had established. They didn't just coexist. They communicated. They played. They loved. But here's what nobody tells you about stories like this. They always begin with death, or the shadow of it, and they always end with a question that has no answer. Because when you cross certain lines, when you enter territories that nature never intended humans to tread, something changes. Not just in the animal, in you. And sometimes, that change is irreversible. Imagine for a moment, you're swimming in murky water, and beneath you moves a creature that has remained virtually unchanged for 200 million years. A creature whose brain operates on pure instinct, whose jaws can exert over 3,700 pounds of pressure per square inch, whose eyes see you not as a person, but as movement, as potential prey, as threat or food. Now imagine choosing willingly to enter that water every single day, to embrace that creature, to sleep beside it, to call it your son. Why would anyone do this? What void in the human heart is so deep, so profound, that only the companionship of a creature designed to kill can fill it? And more disturbing, what does it say about us, about our need for connection, that we would risk everything, our lives, our sanity, our safety, for a bond that shouldn't exist? Right now, you're standing at the edge of a story that will change you. I'm not exaggerating, because what happened in that pool, what Cheeto and Pocho shared, touches something primordial in all of us. Our desperate need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter to someone, even if that someone is a crocodile who could end our existence in seconds. This story has been hidden, misunderstood, dismissed as circus tricks or elaborate hoaxes. But it's real, and the truth behind it is more complex, more beautiful, and more terrifying than any fiction could ever be. Before we go deeper, I need you to do something. Leave a like on this video right now. Not for me, but because this story deserves to be shared with people who are ready to question everything they think they know about the boundaries between human and animal, about the nature of consciousness, about love itself. And in the comments, write, "I'm ready to uncover the hidden truth." By doing this, you're not just engaging with a video. You're declaring yourself part of a community that refuses easy answers, that demands to know what lies beneath the surface of ordinary reality. You're one of the few who dare to look into the abyss and ask, what is really possible? Welcome. You've earned your place here by choosing to continue. Most people would have clicked away by now, uncomfortable with questions that have no safe answers. But not you. You understand that the most profound truths are often the most disturbing. Get ready. What comes next contains a revelation that will forever change how you see the relationship between humans and wild animals. Because Cheeto didn't just tame a crocodile. He crossed into a realm where the rules of nature bend, where the impossible becomes routine, and where love takes forms we were never meant to understand. And what happened in that pool on one ordinary afternoon proved something that science still refuses to acknowledge, that perhaps we are not as alone in our consciousness, our emotions, our capacity for memory and devotion, as we desperately want to believe. The water is waiting, and so is the truth. It was 1989 when Cheeto found him, not in some exotic location, not during an adventure designed to encounter wildlife, but in the most mundane of circumstances, walking along the banks of the Ravenazon River, near his home in Sequoias, Costa Rica, doing what he did every day as a fisherman and local guide. The river was his life, his livelihood, his meditation. He knew every curve, every hidden pool, every place where the current whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen. But that day, the river was screaming. Not literally, of course, but when Cheeto rounded a familiar bend, he saw something that made his blood freeze and his heart break simultaneously. A massive crocodile, approximately 150 kilograms of ancient reptilian power, lying motionless on the muddy bank. At first, he thought it was dead. The massive body was unnaturally still, but as he approached cautiously, he saw the slight rise and fall of breathing. Barely there. Fading. The crocodile had been shot. Multiple times. Through the eye. Through the head. Probably by a cattle rancher protecting livestock, or perhaps by hunters who saw the animal as a trophy or a threat. In rural Costa Rica, crocodiles were both feared and persecuted. They took chickens, threatened dogs, occasionally attacked cattle. A large male like this one would have been seen as a problem to eliminate, not a life to preserve. Cheeto should have walked away. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to leave the dying creature to its fate. Crocodiles were dangerous. This was a wild animal, a predator, a thing of instinct and violence. Even wounded, even dying, it could kill him. One desperate thrash of that powerful tail, one snap of those jaws and a final reflex, and Cheeto would be the one bleeding out on the riverbank instead. But he didn't walk away. He couldn't, because when he looked into that one remaining eye, the other destroyed by a bullet, he saw something that haunted him. Not aggression, not the blank stare of a reptile. He saw, or believed he saw, or needed to see, something else. Pain, fear, and something that looked almost like pleading. I saw myself in him, Cheeto would say years later, trying to explain the inexplicable. I saw someone who had been hurt by the world, someone dying alone, someone who just wanted a chance to live. It was an absurd projection, anthropomorphizing a creature whose brain operated on entirely different principles than human consciousness. Crocodiles don't plead. They don't hope. They don't understand mercy. Or so every zoologist, every expert, every scientist would tell you. But Cheeto didn't care about science in that moment. He cared about the dying creature in front of him. So he did something that defied all logic, all survival instinct, all common sense. He approached the crocodile, got close enough to touch, and when the animal didn't attack, didn't move, just lay there breathing shallowly, Cheeto made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to save it. He was going to take this apex predator, this ancient killer, home. He was going to try to heal it, even though he had no training, no expertise, no idea if such a thing was even possible, even though everyone he knew would think he was insane, even though the rational part of his mind was screaming that this was suicide. Getting the crocodile home was an odyssey in itself. The creature weighed more than Cheeto did. It was over 3 meters long even then, all muscle and armored hide. Cheeto couldn't carry it. He couldn't drag it far. So he improvised, using a small boat, calling in favors from neighbors who thought he'd lost his mind, creating a makeshift stretcher. The entire time, the crocodile barely moved. Too weak, too close to death. When Cheeto finally got the animal to his property, his wife stared at him as if he'd brought home a demon. "That thing will kill you," she said, her voice cold with the certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "It will kill you, or it will kill me, or it will kill our children. You cannot keep a crocodile." But Cheeto was already building a pool, already planning, already committed to something he couldn't name or explain. He placed the wounded crocodile in a large water tank in his backyard, and then he did something even more irrational. He started to care for it, to feed it, to clean its wounds, to talk to it. For 6 months, Cheeto devoted himself to nursing the crocodile back to health. He fed it chicken, fish, anything he could afford. He changed the water daily. He applied antiseptic to the wounds, even though getting close enough to touch the animal's head required a level of trust, or madness, that defied comprehension. And slowly, impossibly, the crocodile began to heal. The destroyed eye never recovered. The scars remained, but the creature lived, grew stronger, started to eat more eagerly. And something else happened, something Cheeto noticed, but couldn't quite articulate at first. The crocodile began to watch him, not with the blank stare of a reptile tracking movement, but with something that looked almost like recognition, almost like interest. "I named him Pocho," Cheeto told his wife one evening, 6 months into this strange vigil. "It's short for poor little thing in Spanish, because that's what he was when I found him. A poor little thing that nobody else would have saved." His wife looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "That poor little thing is a crocodile, Cheeto. It's time to let it go. It's healed now. Take it back to the river." And Cheeto agreed, because as much as he'd grown attached to the creature, as much as he'd invested in saving it, he understood that Pocho was wild, that the river was his home, that keeping a crocodile was not sustainable, not safe, not sane. So one morning, Cheeto loaded Pocho into his boat and took him back to the Revenazon River, back to the place where he'd found him dying, and released him into the water. Pocho slid beneath the surface without a backward glance, disappeared into the murky depths, and Cheeto felt something unexpected, a profound sense of loss, as if he'd just said goodbye to someone who mattered, someone who understood him in ways other humans never could. He went home, tried to return to normal life, tried to forget about the crocodile he'd saved. But 3 days later, when Cheeto walked to his backyard in the morning, he found Pocho there, in the empty pool, having somehow navigated kilometers of terrain to return to Cheeto's home, waiting. And that's when everything changed. The first time Cheeto entered the water with Pocho, he was certain he was going to die. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to recognize that what he was about to do violated every principle of self-preservation that had kept humans alive for millions of years. You don't enter the water with a crocodile. You don't approach a predator that can kill you effortlessly. You don't test the boundaries of trust with a creature whose brain operates on hunger and territoriality and instinct. But Pocho had returned. After being released back into the wild, after being given his freedom, the crocodile had chosen to come back. That single act changed everything in Cheeto's mind. This wasn't just about saving an animal anymore. This was about something deeper, something that defied easy categorization. Pocho had chosen him, had rejected the river, rejected freedom, rejected the wild, to return to this human who had saved him. So Cheeto built a proper pool. Not a small tank, but a substantial body of water where Pocho could swim, could move naturally, could live in something approximating comfort. It was all Cheeto could afford. His fishing income wasn't substantial, and maintaining a crocodile was expensive. But he managed. He always managed. Because by then, Pocho wasn't just an animal he'd saved. Pocho was family. The first entry into the water was gradual. Cheeto didn't just jump in. He started by sitting at the pool's edge, feet in the water, while Pocho swam nearby. The crocodile would approach, would come close, would watch Cheeto with that one good eye. And Cheeto would talk to him, constantly, as if Pocho could understand every word. "I know you won't hurt me," Cheeto would say, his voice steady despite the fear hammering in his chest. "I know you remember that I saved you. I know you're different. I know you understand." It was absurd. Crocodiles don't understand Spanish. They don't process human language. They don't form emotional bonds based on gratitude or memory or affection. Every expert would tell you that what Cheeto believed was happening was nothing more than the crocodile tolerating a food source. That any appearance of connection was pure projection, human need imposing meaning on animal behavior that had none. But day after day, Cheeto would sit there, feet in the water, and Pocho would come close, would rest his massive head near Cheeto's legs, would remain still, calm, unthreatening. And gradually, over weeks, Cheeto's fear began to transform into something else. Not confidence exactly, but trust. The kind of trust that defies reason. One morning, Cheeto slid fully into the water. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or ceremony. He simply lowered himself in, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and swam toward Pocho. The crocodile watched him approach, didn't move away, didn't show aggression, just watched. And when Cheeto reached out, his hand trembling, and touched Pocho's scarred head, the crocodile didn't attack, didn't snap, didn't thrash. He simply accepted the touch, his one eye half closing, his massive body relaxing in the water. It was the single most terrifying and most beautiful moment of Cheeto's life. From that day forward, they swam together, daily, sometimes for hours. Cheeto would climb onto Pocho's back, would embrace the creature's massive body, would put his head near those jaws that could crush his skull with minimal effort, and Pocho would swim gently, would support Cheeto's weight, would move with a carefulness that seemed impossible for a creature of instinct and violence. Cheeto's family thought he was insane. His wife left him, unable to live with the constant fear, unable to accept that her husband valued a crocodile over his own safety, over their marriage, over any semblance of normal life. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors whispered that Cheeto had lost his mind, that grief or loneliness or some unnamed trauma had broken something inside him, that eventually the crocodile would remember what it was and Cheeto would be found torn apart in that pool. But Cheeto didn't care, because with Pocho, he experienced something he'd never found with other humans. Complete acceptance, unconditional presence, a bond that required no words, no explanations, no social performance. Pocho didn't judge him, didn't expect anything beyond food and companionship, didn't care about Cheeto's failures or successes or any of the 1,000 ways humans measure and categorize each other. "He is my son," Cheeto began telling people, his voice defiant against their skepticism. "I know how that sounds. I know you think I'm crazy. But Pocho is my son. He chose me. He returned to me. He trusts me with his life, and I trust him with mine. That makes us family." Word began to spread. Locals would come to Cheeto's property, drawn by curiosity or disbelief, or the simple human hunger for spectacle. They would watch as Cheeto swam with Pocho, as he played with the massive crocodile, as he demonstrated a connection that shouldn't exist. And slowly, impossibly, Cheeto became something of a local legend, the man who swam with crocodiles, the fisherman who had tamed a monster. But Cheeto hated that word, tamed, because taming implied domination, control, the breaking of an animal's will to suit human purposes. What he had with Pocho wasn't taming. It was relationship. It was mutual trust built over years of consistent presence. It was, he insisted, love. Scientists began to take notice. Researchers would visit, would observe, would measure and document and analyze. They confirmed what couldn't be denied. Cheeto and Pocho had developed a bond that defied current understanding of crocodile behavior. The animal showed no aggression toward Cheeto, demonstrated what appeared to be recognition and preference for his presence, and engaged in behaviors, play, physical affection, apparent emotional response, that crocodiles simply weren't supposed to be capable of. But even as they documented it, most scientists refused to call it what Cheeto knew it was. They used clinical language, habituation, conditioning, tolerance of human presence. They couldn't bring themselves to say friendship or love or bond, because to do so would require acknowledging that perhaps the boundaries between human and animal consciousness aren't as clear as we need them to be, that perhaps other creatures experience emotions, memories, attachments in ways we've systematically refused to recognize. Cheeto didn't need scientific validation. He had something more valuable, certainty born from daily experience. He knew Pocho loved him, not in the complex, language-based way humans love, perhaps, but in some other way. Some deeper, simpler, more honest way. Years passed. Cheeto and Pocho's routine became legendary. Tourists would come to see them. Documentary crews would film them. Cheeto eventually charged admission, not to get rich, but simply to afford to feed Pocho and maintain their life together. The crocodile ate approximately 30 kilograms of food per week. It was expensive, but Cheeto never considered giving up. And Pocho grew, from 150 kilograms to over 450 kilograms, from 3 meters to nearly 5 meters. A massive, ancient creature in the prime of his power. Any day, the skeptics said, any day the crocodile would remember what it was. Any day, instinct would override whatever strange anomaly had created this bond. Any day, Cheeto would pay for his hubris with his life. But that day never came. Instead, something else happened. Something that would prove, beyond any doubt, that what existed between Cheeto and Pocho was real. It started as a way to earn money to support Pocho. Cheeto needed income, and people wanted to see the impossible, a man swimming with a crocodile. So he began offering public demonstrations. Every Sunday, tourists and locals would gather at a small property in Sequoias, pay a modest fee, and watch as Cheeto performed what seemed like a death-defying act, but what was, to him, simply spending time with his son. The performances were simple. Cheeto would enter the water, swim to Pocho, embrace the massive crocodile, and then they would move through the water together in a kind of aquatic dance. Cheeto would spin in the water, and Pocho would follow. Cheeto would dive, and Pocho would submerge with him. Cheeto would float on his back, and Pocho would glide beneath him, supporting his weight on that broad, armored back. But the most breathtaking moment, the one that made audiences gasp and cover their mouths in horror and wonder, was when Cheeto would place his head inside Pocho's open mouth. Those massive jaws, capable of crushing bone, would remain perfectly still, perfectly controlled, while Cheeto rested his temple against Pocho's teeth. It was an image of trust so absolute, so extreme, that it seemed to violate reality itself. "This is not a trick," Cheeto would tell the stunned audiences afterward. "This is not training or conditioning or dominance. This is love. This is family. Pocho trusts me not to hurt him, and I trust him not to hurt me. That is all. That is everything." The performances made Cheeto moderately wealthy by local standards. Not rich, but comfortable. He could afford to feed Pocho properly, maintain the pool, live simply. But more importantly, the demonstration served another purpose. They forced people to question their assumptions about animals, about consciousness, about the possibility of cross-species connection. Audiences would leave shaken, their worldviews disturbed, because watching Cheeto and Pocho wasn't like watching a circus act or a trained animal performance. It was watching something that looked like genuine affection between beings that should be predator and prey. And that image haunted people. It made them wonder, what else have we gotten wrong about the inner lives of animals? What other connections are possible that we've dismissed as impossible? Television crews came. National Geographic, Discovery Channel, Animal Planet. Documentaries were made. Cheeto and Pocho became international sensations. The man who swam with crocodiles. The impossible bond. The reptilian sun. Headlines captured the spectacle but missed the deeper truth. This wasn't about spectacle at all. It was about two beings who had found in each other something neither could find elsewhere. But fame brought complications. Skeptics became more vocal. Animal rights activists questioned whether keeping Pocho was ethical, whether the performances caused stress, whether Cheeto was exploiting the crocodile. Experts continued to insist that what appeared to be affection was really just habituation, that Pocho tolerated Cheeto because Cheeto fed him, that the bond was a human fantasy projected onto an animal incapable of such connections. Cheeto addressed these concerns directly. "Pocho chose to stay," he would say repeatedly. "I released him back into the wild. He returned. The river is right there. He could leave any time, but he stays. Because he wants to be here. Because this is his home. Because I am his family." And it was true. The pool wasn't enclosed. Pocho could have left whenever he wanted, but he never did. For over 20 years, Pocho remained with Cheeto, never attempting to escape, never showing desire to return to the wild. It was voluntary captivity, if such a thing could be said to exist. Or perhaps it wasn't captivity at all. Perhaps it was simply choice. The choice to remain with the being who had saved him, who had cared for him, who had shown him something that wild crocodiles never experience: consistent, non-predatory companionship. During the performances, Cheeto would narrate what he was doing, explaining each action to the audience. "Now I'm going to swim to him. Watch his body language. See how he positions himself to receive me? That's communication. He's telling me he's ready for interaction." And indeed, Pocho would adjust his position, would orient toward Cheeto, would make space in the water for his human companion. "Now I'm going to place my hand on his head. This is a vulnerable moment for both of us. He could snap at my hand. I could accidentally hurt his injured eye. But we trust each other." and Cheeto would stroke Pocho's scarred head, and the massive crocodile would remain still, that one eye half closing in what looked unmistakably like contentment. The most controversial part of the performance was the kiss. Cheeto would lean forward and press his lips to Pocho's snout, a gesture of affection that made zoologists cringe and audiences gasp. It was dangerous beyond measure. A reflexive movement from Pocho, an instinctive snap, and Cheeto's face would be gone. But it never happened. Pocho accepted the kiss, remained motionless, and sometimes would open his mouth slightly as if responding in his own reptilian way. People ask me if I'm afraid. Cheeto would tell the audiences. The answer is no. Not anymore. I was terrified the first time I entered the water. Terrified the first time I touched him. Terrified the first time I put my head near his jaws. But fear disappeared as trust grew. Now I'm only afraid of one thing: losing him. Because Pocho has given me something I never found with other humans. Pure, uncomplicated love. The performances ran for 15 years. Every Sunday, weather permitting, tourists would gather. Cheeto would swim with Pocho. The impossible would become routine. But it never stopped being miraculous. Because no matter how many times people watched, no matter how familiar the performance became, the fundamental impossibility of it remained. A man and a crocodile, moving through water together, trusting each other with their lives. And then, on one ordinary Sunday in 2011, something happened during a performance that would prove, beyond any remaining doubt, that what existed between Cheeto and Pocho was far more than habituation or conditioning or the tolerance of a well-fed predator. The pool was crowded with spectators that day. More than usual. Word had spread about Cheeto and Pocho, and tourists had come from San Jose, from other parts of Costa Rica, even from neighboring countries. They pressed against the barriers around the pool, cameras ready, conversations humming with anticipation and nervous excitement. They'd come to see the impossible. They had no idea they were about to witness something even more extraordinary. Cheeto entered the water as he always did, calmly, confidently, speaking softly to Pocho. The massive crocodile was resting in his usual spot, partially submerged, his scarred head visible above the waterline. His one good eye tracked Cheeto's approach. Nothing seemed unusual. It was just another Sunday, just another performance, just another demonstration of the bond that had made them famous. But then, without warning, without any apparent provocation, Pocho suddenly submerged completely, disappeared beneath the murky water. The audience murmured, uncertain. Was this part of the show? Cheeto stood waist-deep in the pool, looking around, his expression shifting from calm to concerned. He called Pocho's name. The water remained still. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The audience's murmurs turned to worried whispers. Where was the crocodile? Was something wrong? Had Pocho gotten sick? Or worse, had the years of trust finally shattered? Was this the moment skeptics had predicted, when instinct would override relationship, and Cheeto would pay the ultimate price for his hubris? Cheeto remained in the water, rotating slowly, scanning the pool's surface. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. Pocho, he called again. Pocho, come here. Nothing. Just silence and ripples. Then the water erupted, not with the violent attack everyone feared, but with something else entirely. Pocho burst from the water directly in front of Cheeto, his massive body surging upward with astonishing speed. The audience screamed. Several people stumbled backward. Cameras dropped. In that split second, everyone watching believed they were about to witness a man being killed. But Pocho didn't attack. Instead, he positioned himself directly in front of Cheeto, his massive head level with the man's chest, and opened his jaws wide, wider than Cheeto had ever seen them open during their performances, wide enough to engulf Cheeto's entire head and shoulders. The afternoon sun illuminated the pale pink interior of Pocho's mouth, the rows of conical teeth, the powerful muscles that could snap shut with lethal force. Cheeto froze, not from fear, those who were close enough could see, but from surprise. This wasn't part of their usual routine. This was something new, something Pocho was initiating, something Cheeto didn't understand. The crocodile held that position, jaws open, body still, looking directly at Cheeto with that one scarred eye. And in that moment, something passed between them, some communication beyond language, beyond any human understanding of how consciousness works. Cheeto later said he heard Pocho's voice in his mind, though he knew that was impossible, knew it was his own interpretation of the crocodile's body language. But the message was clear: trust me. The entire pool area had gone silent. No one breathed. No one moved. They watched as Cheeto, with movements so slow they seemed to exist outside normal time, leaned forward and placed his entire head inside Pocho's open mouth. Not just resting against the teeth, as he sometimes did during performances, but fully inside, surrounded by those jaws, vulnerable beyond any measure. A woman in the audience fainted. Several people turned away, unable to watch what they believed would be carnage. But most remained transfixed, unable to look away from the impossible image. A man's head completely inside a crocodile's mouth, while the massive reptile remained perfectly, impossibly still. Seconds stretched into eternity. Cheeto's head was inside Pocho's mouth for what witnesses later estimated was between 20 and 30 seconds, though time had become elastic, unreliable. The crocodile didn't move, didn't close his jaws even a fraction, didn't show any tension or aggression. He simply held perfectly still, trusting Cheeto to trust him, demonstrating a level of control and awareness that shouldn't be possible for a creature of pure instinct. When Cheeto finally withdrew his head, moving with the same glacial slowness, Pocho gently closed his mouth and made a sound. Not quite a hiss, not quite a rumble, but something softer, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Then he dove back underwater, as if what had just happened was entirely normal, and resurfaced a moment later in his usual resting spot. The audience exploded, not with applause exactly, but with a collective release of held breath, nervous laughter, exclamations of disbelief. People were crying. Others were arguing about what they'd just seen, unable to process it. Cameras had captured the moment, but even photographic evidence seemed inadequate to the reality of what had occurred. Cheeto waded to the edge of the pool, his legs shaking now with the adrenaline he'd suppressed during the moment itself. He sat on the edge, his face pale but his expression radiant. He was laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by what had just happened. "Did you see that?" he asked the stunned audience, his voice thick with emotion. "Did you understand what just happened? Pocho wanted to prove to you what I've been telling you for years. He wanted to show you that what we have is real, that he trusts me absolutely, that I trust him absolutely, that we are family." Later, when reporters asked him to explain what had occurred, Cheeto struggled to find words. "Pocho knew," he said finally. "He knew that people doubted our bond. He knew that experts said our relationship was impossible, that I was projecting human emotions onto an animal incapable of such feelings. And he decided to prove them wrong. He decided to demonstrate, in the most dramatic way possible, that what exists between us is real." Scientists who reviewed the footage were baffled. Crocodile behavior experts couldn't explain it. The level of control Pocho demonstrated, the apparent intentionality of the action, the sustained restraint required to hold his jaws open without movement while a human head was inside his mouth. None of it fit within established understanding of reptilian cognition or behavior. Some insisted it was still just conditioning, that Pocho had been trained through years of positive reinforcement to tolerate increasingly intrusive contact. But that explanation failed to account for the spontaneity of the action, the fact that Pocho initiated it, the apparent deliberateness of the demonstration. Others suggested it was a feeding behavior, that Pocho was testing whether Cheeto could fit in his mouth, preparing for an eventual attack. But that theory collapsed under the observation that Pocho could have attacked at any point during those 20 seconds. He had Cheeto completely vulnerable, completely at his mercy. If predatory instinct was going to override relationship, that would have been the moment. But it didn't happen. The simplest explanation, and the one most scientists refused to accept, was also the one Cheeto had been offering for years. Pocho loved him. In whatever way a crocodile can love, Pocho loved Cheeto. And that day, he wanted to prove it. He wanted to demonstrate, to the skeptics and doubters and scientific experts who insisted such bonds were impossible, that they were wrong, that consciousness and emotion and connection exist in forms and species we don't yet understand. From that day forward, The head-and-mouth gesture became part of their regular performance. But it was never routine. Every time Cheeto placed his head inside Pocho's jaws, it remained an act of absolute trust, an affirmation of a bond that defied nature's laws. And audiences never stopped being awed by it. But the most profound thing about that moment in 2011 wasn't the spectacle. It was what it revealed about both beings. Pocho proved he was capable of extraordinary restraint, awareness, and what looked undeniably like intentional communication. And Cheeto proved he was willing to trust Pocho with his life, literally and completely, even when doing so defied every survival instinct humans possess. That moment changed how many people thought about animals. It didn't convince the hardcore skeptics, nothing ever would, but it planted a question in millions of minds. What if we're wrong? What if the boundaries between species, between types of consciousness, between human and animal experience, are far more permeable than we've assumed? What if love, trust, loyalty, and memory exist in forms we simply haven't bothered to recognize because acknowledging them would require us to completely reconsider our relationship with the natural world? Those questions had no easy answers, but they were the right questions, and Pocho and Cheeto had forced the world to ask them. Living with Pocho wasn't the fairy tale that tourists saw during Sunday performances. Behind the miraculous bond was a daily reality that was exhausting, expensive, isolating, and often heartbreaking. Cheeto paid a price for his choice to build a life around a crocodile. A steep price, one that most people, if they truly understood it, would never be willing to pay. His marriage ended. His wife couldn't live with the constant presence of danger, couldn't accept that Cheeto prioritized Pocho over her safety, over their relationship, over any semblance of normal family life. She left, and Cheeto didn't try to stop her, because he understood, on some level, that what he'd chosen was incompatible with conventional human relationships. You couldn't ask someone to share their life with a person whose primary emotional connection was to a predator. It wasn't fair. It wasn't reasonable. It wasn't sustainable. His children were torn. They loved their father, but they also feared Pocho. They visited less as they grew older, disturbed by what they saw as their father's obsession, worried that one day they'd receive a phone call telling them Cheeto had been killed. They didn't understand why their father's love for a crocodile seemed deeper, more committed, more unconditional than his love for them. And Cheeto couldn't explain it in a way that made sense. How do you tell your children that a creature who can't speak, who operates on instinct, who isn't even mammalian, understands you in ways other humans never have? Financially, maintaining Pocho was a constant strain. The crocodile ate approximately 30 kilograms of meat and fish per week. That's roughly 120 kilograms per month, over 1,400 kilograms per year. Even buying the cheapest cuts of meat and fish, the cost was staggering for a fisherman's income. The Sunday performances helped, but they didn't make Cheeto wealthy. They made him viable. Barely. The pool required constant maintenance. Water had to be changed regularly to prevent bacterial growth. The concrete needed repairs. During rainy season, flooding was a constant threat. During dry season, water levels had to be monitored obsessively. It was a full-time job, and Cheeto did it alone. Because who else would help maintain a pool for a crocodile? Who else would share that particular madness? Socially, Cheeto became increasingly isolated. Most of his old friends drifted away, disturbed by his choices, unable to understand why he'd essentially withdrawn from human society to live with a reptile. New friendships were difficult because Cheeto couldn't leave Pocho for extended periods. The crocodile needed to be fed daily, needed company, needed the presence of the one being in the world he recognized and trusted. So Cheeto stayed home, day after day, year after year, his world shrinking to the dimensions of his property, his pool, his crocodile. There were moments of profound loneliness, nights when Cheeto sat by the pool, watching Pocho sleep in the water, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, wondered if the experts were right, if what he believed was love was really just the tolerance of a well-fed predator, wondered if he'd sacrificed his human connections for something that existed only in his imagination. But then Pocho would wake, would swim to the edge of the pool, would rest his massive head near Cheeto's feet, and the doubts would dissolve, because the connection was real. Whatever it was, love, bond, attachment, Recognition, it was real. Cheeto could feel it as surely as he could feel the night air on his skin. The physical toll was significant too. Swimming with a massive crocodile daily, even a gentle one, was hard on Cheeto's body. He suffered injuries, scratches from Pocho's rough hide, bruises from accidental impacts during their aquatic play, infections from the bacteria-laden pool water entering small wounds. Nothing major, nothing life-threatening, but a constant reminder that what he was doing was physically demanding and potentially dangerous. And there was the constant fear underneath it all. Not fear of Pocho attacking. That fear had long since disappeared. But fear of loss. Fear that Pocho would get sick. Fear that age would catch up with either of them. Fear that one morning Cheeto would wake up and find Pocho's massive body floating lifeless in the pool. Fear that this miracle, this impossible connection, was temporary and would eventually end in heartbreak. Crocodiles can live for 70 years or more. Pocho was mature when Cheeto found him, perhaps 20 to 25 years old, which meant that if both of them lived to natural old age, they might have decades together. But that also meant Pocho might outlive Cheeto. And what would happen then? Who would take care of Pocho? Who else would Pocho accept? Or would the crocodile pine for Cheeto? Starve himself? Die of loneliness? Could crocodiles even experience grief? Cheeto believed they could, and that belief terrified him. There were practical considerations, too. When Cheeto got sick, a bad flu that left him bedridden for a week, he had to rely on a neighbor to feed Pocho. But Pocho wouldn't eat from the neighbor, wouldn't accept food from anyone but Cheeto. For a week, the crocodile fasted, waiting for his human companion to recover. It was a stark reminder that their bond, as beautiful as it was, had made Pocho dependent on Cheeto in ways that were potentially dangerous for the animal. The performances, while necessary for income, took their own toll. Having strangers gather every Sunday to watch him with Pocho felt increasingly invasive. What was intimate and sacred became spectacle. What was deeply personal became public entertainment. Cheeto did it because he had to, because feeding Pocho required money, but he resented it. He wished he could simply live with his companion in peace, without cameras, without crowds, without the constant need to prove and justify and explain. And always, always, there were the critics, animal rights activists who insisted Pocho should be released, ignoring the fact that Pocho had chosen to stay. Zoologists who continued to claim the bond was an illusion, a projection, a misunderstanding of reptilian behavior. Neighbors who thought Cheeto was crazy, dangerous, a man who had lost his grip on reality. He heard it all. The criticism, the skepticism, the mockery. And it hurt, because what he had with Pocho was the most real, most honest, most profound connection he'd ever experienced. And the world's refusal to acknowledge it felt like a constant invalidation of the most important relationship in his life. But Cheeto endured. Day after day, year after year, he chose Pocho over everything else. Over wealth, over conventional happiness, over human relationships, over social acceptance. He chose the crocodile, because Pocho, in his own way, had chosen him first. And that choice, that mutual selection across the species divide, was worth every sacrifice. People would ask Cheeto if he regretted his choices, if he wished he'd lived a normal life, if he mourned the marriage, the friendships, the human connections he'd forfeited. His answer was always the same. No. Never. Pocho gave me something I never found with people. He sees me. He knows me. He loves me without condition, without expectation, without judgment. How many humans can say they have that? How many people find that kind of pure connection? I'm not lonely. I have Pocho. And that's enough. That's more than enough. It was a strange kind of contentment. Not the happiness society promised, marriage, family, community, conventional success, but something else. Something deeper and lonelier and more authentic. The contentment of being truly seen by another being, even if that being was a crocodile most of the world thought was incapable of seeing anything beyond prey and territory. And so Cheeto's life continued. Small, isolated, centered entirely around a pool and a crocodile. To outsiders it looked like sacrifice, like loss, like a man who'd given up everything for a delusion. But to Cheeto it was simply love. Difficult, costly, Unconventional love, but love nonetheless. And love, he believed, was always worth the price. Over the years, Cheeto and Pocho developed their own form of communication. Not language in a human sense. There were no words, no grammar, no symbolic representation, but communication nonetheless. A complex system of gestures, sounds, timing, and body language that allowed them to coordinate, to play, to understand each other's needs and moods with a precision that seemed impossible for a human and a reptile. Cheeto learned to read Pocho's postures with the fluency most people reserve for reading text. When Pocho floated with his body slightly angled, head turned to the left, it meant he was relaxed and receptive to interaction. When his tail made small, rapid movements just beneath the water surface, it signaled playfulness, an invitation to engage. When he submerged completely and stayed down longer than usual, it meant he wanted solitude, needed time alone, and Cheeto would respect that boundary just as he would with any other family member. Pocho, in turn, learned to interpret Cheeto's intentions before actions manifested. When Cheeto approached the pool with his shoulders relaxed and his movements unhurried, Pocho knew it was time for their daily swim, for companionship, for the physical closeness that defined their bond. When Cheeto's stride was quicker, more purposeful, Pocho understood it was feeding time and would position himself near the feeding spot. When Cheeto sat silently at the pool's edge for extended periods, staring at nothing in particular, Pocho seemed to recognize sadness or contemplation and would remain nearby, but give space. A quiet presence that asked nothing but offered everything. The sounds they made to each other formed their own vocabulary. Cheeto developed a specific call, a low, rhythmic hum. That meant he was about to enter the water. Pocho would respond with a soft rumble, so low it was almost subsonic, a sound that translated roughly to acknowledgement, permission, welcome. When they played, Cheeto would click his tongue against his teeth in rapid patterns, and Pocho would respond by opening his mouth slightly and exhaling sharply, producing a hiss that sounded almost like laughter if you listened with the right ears. Most people who observed them noticed these exchanges, but dismissed them as trained responses, Pavlovian conditioning, the mechanical output of stimulus-response chains. But Cheeto knew better, because the communication wasn't fixed. It evolved. New signals emerged organically. Patterns changed based on context. Pocho could differentiate between Cheeto's call when he wanted to swim versus when he wanted to clean the pool versus when he just wanted to sit together. That level of discrimination, that contextual awareness, suggested something far more sophisticated than simple conditioning. During their performances, this communication became visible to audiences, though few recognized it for what it was. Cheeto would make a gesture, a slight tilt of his head, a particular hand movement, and Pocho would respond appropriately. Audiences thought it was training, tricks, commands followed by a well-conditioned animal. But it wasn't that simple, because Pocho didn't just respond to signals. He initiated interaction. He made suggestions through his own body language, proposing activities, expressing preferences, refusing certain interactions if he wasn't in the mood. Once, during a performance, Cheeto tried to guide Pocho into their usual opening sequence, a slow circle around the pool. But Pocho didn't move. Instead, he swam to the far end of the pool and made a specific vocalization, a sound Cheeto had learned meant different. Pocho wanted to do something different that day. So Cheeto followed Pocho's lead, and they improvised a new routine. The audience had no idea they were witnessing genuine negotiation, genuine agency from a creature they assumed operated purely on instinct and conditioning. This language between them revealed something that made scientists deeply uncomfortable. Pocho had preferences. He had moods. He made choices. He wasn't simply responding to Cheeto's cues. He was an active participant in their relationship, with his own desires and intentions that Cheeto had to respect for their bond to function. There were days when Pocho clearly didn't want to perform. When tourists would arrive and Cheeto would prepare for the Sunday show, Pocho would sometimes remain at the far end of the pool, his body language closed, unresponsive. Cheeto learned to recognize this refusal. On those days, he would apologize to the disappointed tourists, refund their money, and explain that Pocho wasn't in the mood. People thought Cheeto was being eccentric, projecting human emotions onto an animal. But Cheeto knew. Forcing interaction when Pocho had signaled unwillingness would damage their trust. And trust was everything. The most complex aspect of their communication was emotional. Cheeto swore that Pocho could sense his emotional states with uncanny accuracy. When Cheeto was sad, mourning his failed marriage, grieving the distance from his children, feeling the weight of isolation, Pocho would behave differently. More gentle, more present. He would rest his head on the pool's edge near where Cheeto sat, would remain motionless for hours if necessary, a solid, companionable presence that asked nothing and offered everything. When Cheeto was happy, excited about something, Pocho's energy would shift to match. More playful, more active. They would swim faster, play rougher, engage in a kind of exuberant physical interaction that looked dangerously chaotic to observers, but was actually highly controlled, both beings aware of boundaries and limits. Scientific explanations existed for some of this. Crocodiles can detect subtle changes in water movement, electromagnetic fields, even chemical signals. Perhaps Pocho was responding to physiological changes in Cheeto, stress hormones manifesting as altered scent, happiness producing different movement patterns. But even if the mechanism was biological rather than empathetic in the human sense, the result was the same. Pocho responded to Cheeto's emotional states. He adjusted his behavior based on Cheeto's needs. That suggested awareness, flexibility, responsiveness, all characteristics we usually reserve for describing sophisticated social cognition. Over 2 decades together, their communication deepened into something that went beyond any specific signal or sound. They developed what can only be described as intuitive understanding. Cheeto would know, without any obvious cue, when Pocho needed the pool water changed, when he was feeling unwell, when he wanted more interaction or less, when he was content or restless. And Pocho seemed to possess similar knowledge about Cheeto, responding to unspoken needs with what looked remarkably like consideration. Researchers who studied their relationship extensively noted one particular phenomenon that defied easy explanation: synchronization. When swimming together, Cheeto and Pocho would often move in perfect harmony, without any visible signals passing between them. Cheeto would turn, and Pocho would turn with him. Cheeto would dive, and Pocho would match his depth and trajectory. They would surface simultaneously, as if choreographed, despite being out of visual contact during the dive. This kind of synchronization appears in bonded pairs across many species: mated birds, mother and infant primates, even human dancers. But it had never been documented between a human and a reptile. It suggested that Pocho was attending to Cheeto with an intensity that required constant monitoring, constant adjustment, constant awareness of his companion's position and intentions. That level of sustained attention typically only appears in creatures motivated by strong social bonds. Cheeto tried to teach others to interact with Pocho, thinking that perhaps he could train someone to care for the crocodile if something happened to him. But every attempt failed. Pocho refused to respond to anyone else's signals, wouldn't accept food from other hands, showed no interest in interaction with anyone but Cheeto. It wasn't that others couldn't learn the signals. It's that Pocho didn't care about the signals themselves. What mattered was who was making them. The communication wasn't universal. It was specific to their relationship. This specificity proved what Cheeto had always known. Their bond wasn't about training or conditioning or learned responses. It was about relationship. Pocho hadn't learned to respond to certain stimuli. He'd learned to communicate with Cheeto specifically, to attend to Cheeto uniquely, to engage with this particular human in ways he wouldn't engage with any other being. Their language was private, intimate, incomprehensible to outsiders. People could observe it, document it, analyze it, but they couldn't truly understand it because they weren't part of it. Communication requires shared context, shared history, shared meaning. Cheeto and Pocho had 20 years of shared experience, of daily interaction, of building mutual understanding gesture by gesture, sound by sound, moment by moment. It was a language of two, a language that would die when either of them died, because no one else could learn it, and no one else mattered. They had built their own private world of meaning, and that world was enough. In that world, they were perfectly understood, perfectly known. And isn't that what everyone wants? To be truly seen by someone? to communicate without pretense or misunderstanding, to have someone who knows your signals, responds to your needs, participates in your life with full attention and genuine presence. Cheeto had found that with a crocodile, and that strange, beautiful, impossible fact was worth every criticism, every skeptical analysis, every scientific paper that tried to reduce their bond to stimulus-response chains and anthropomorphic projection. Because even if the scientists were right about the mechanisms, neurochemistry, conditioning, pattern recognition, they were wrong about the meaning. The communication between Cheeto and Pocho was real. The understanding was real. The relationship was real. And that reality existed in a language no one else would ever speak. It happened in 2010. Pocho, who had been the picture of health despite his old injuries, began to slow down. At first, the changes were subtle. He ate slightly less, took longer to warm up for their daily swims, spent more time resting in his favorite corner of the pool. Cheeto noticed immediately, after 20 years together, he could detect variations in Pocho's behavior that would be invisible to anyone else. But he told himself it was nothing serious. Pocho was getting older. They both were. Slowing down was natural, expected, nothing to panic about. But the changes continued, accelerated. Within weeks, Pocho's decline became undeniable. He stopped eating entirely, would refuse even his favorite foods, the fatty chicken pieces, the fresh fish Cheeto bought specially for him. His movements became lethargic. He would float motionless in the water for hours, barely responding even to Cheeto's presence. Cheeto was terrified. He'd lived with the fear of losing Pocho for 2 decades, but facing the actual possibility shattered him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He called veterinarians, specialists in exotic animals, anyone who might know how to help a geriatric crocodile. Most refused to treat Pocho. Working with a massive, potentially dangerous reptile was beyond their expertise or willingness. Those who did come could offer little help. Crocodiles were difficult to diagnose, difficult to treat. Their physiology was so different from mammals that standard veterinary practices often didn't apply. One veterinarian examined Pocho as thoroughly as possible from the pool's edge. Getting close to a sick crocodile was dangerous, even one as gentle as Pocho. The diagnosis was vague but grim. Old age, possibly organ failure. Crocodiles hide illness well. By the time they show symptoms, they're often too far gone for intervention. I'm sorry. There's not much we can do. Keep him comfortable. Spend time with him. Prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. As if you could prepare for losing the most important being in your life. As if 2 decades of daily intimacy could be packed away with advance notice. As if love operated on a schedule that allowed for preparation and acceptance. Cheeto stopped doing performances. Stopped caring about income, about tourists, about anything except Pocho. He spent every possible moment at the pool, sitting with his companion, talking to him, touching him gently, trying to communicate comfort and presence. He slept beside the pool, wrapped in a blanket, unwilling to leave Pocho alone during what might be his final days. "Please don't go," Cheeto would whisper to the massive creature floating listlessly in the water. "Please don't leave me. I don't know how to live without you. You're my family. You're my son. Please." Pocho's one good eye would track Cheeto when he spoke, and sometimes the great reptile would make a soft sound, that low rumble that meant acknowledgement, presence, "I'm here." But the eye was dimmer now. The response is slower. Pocho was fading, and Cheeto felt like he was fading with him. Days became a week, then 2 weeks. Pocho hadn't eaten in over a month. He'd lost significant weight. His movements were minimal. Every morning, Cheeto would wake with his heart hammering, terrified that he'd find Pocho dead. And every morning, Pocho was still alive. Barely, but alive. Cheeto prayed. He wasn't particularly religious, but desperation makes believers of us all. He prayed to God, to nature, to whatever force might be listening. "Please. Not yet. We need more time. Please." And then, impossibly, Pocho began to improve. Slowly at first, he accepted a small piece of fish from Cheeto's hand. Then another the next day. His movements became slightly more energetic. The lethargy began to lift. After 3 weeks of decline, Pocho was recovering. The veterinarian couldn't explain it. Sometimes animals rally. Sometimes they pull through against all expectations. Consider it a gift. But understand, this is probably temporary. Whatever is affecting him will likely return. Use this time well. Cheeto used it very well. For the next year, he cherished every moment with Pocho. Their swims became sacred again. Not performances, but pure connection. He stopped worrying about money, about the future, about anything except being present with his companion. Because he understood now, in his bones, that their time together was finite. That the miracle couldn't last forever. That eventually, despite all his love and care and devotion, he was going to lose Pocho. That knowledge changed something in their relationship, made it deeper, more precious. Cheeto stopped taking any moment for granted. Every swim, every touch, every quiet hour, sitting together beside the pool, became a treasure to be savored completely. Pocho seemed to sense this shift. His behavior changed too, more gentle, more deliberately affectionate, as if he also understood that their time was limited and wanted to make every interaction count. When they swam, Pocho moved with elaborate care, ensuring that Cheeto was always safe, always comfortable. When they rested, Pocho would position himself so Cheeto could easily reach him, could maintain physical contact, could feel the solid presence of his companion. It was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure, because underlying every moment was the knowledge that this was temporary, that they were living on borrowed time, that the reprieve Pocho had been granted wouldn't last forever. But Cheeto refused to let grief contaminate the present. Yes, loss was coming. But right now, Pocho was alive, was present, was here. And that was enough. That had to be enough. For 1 full year, Pocho remained relatively stable. He ate regularly, participated in occasional performances when he seemed willing, maintained his bond with Cheeto. It was like a gift, one final year of normalcy before the end. Cheeto used that year to prepare emotionally, though he knew no amount of preparation would make losing Pocho bearable. He talked to Pocho constantly, telling him everything. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for 20 years of being my family. Thank you for showing the world that bonds can exist in places science says they're impossible. Thank you for loving me, in whatever way crocodiles love. Thank you for being my son. And Pocho would listen, his eye half closed, his body relaxed, as if he understood every word, as if he was also saying goodbye, in his own reptilian way. Nature had intervened to give them 1 more year, 1 final year of being together, of maintaining their impossible bond, of defying the boundaries between species just by continuing to exist side by side. It was generous and cruel in equal measure, because having that extra time made the approaching loss both more bearable and more devastating. More bearable because they could savor it, could make it meaningful, could say everything that needed to be said. More devastating because every moment of joy was shadowed by the knowledge that it was temporary, that the clock was ticking, that no matter how much they loved each other, mortality would win in the end. But for that year, they had each other, fully, completely, and they made it count. October 12, 2011. The date is burned into Cheeto's memory like a brand. The morning started like any other morning in their 23 years together. Cheeto woke at dawn, walked to the pool, called Pocho's name. The massive crocodile surfaced as he always did, his one good eye finding Cheeto immediately, his body orienting toward his human companion. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing signaled that this would be the last time. Cheeto entered the water for their morning swim. Pocho moved toward him, and they embraced as they had thousands of times before. Cheeto's arms around the crocodile's massive body, Pocho's weight supporting him in the water. They moved through their aquatic dance, the intimate choreography they developed over 2 decades, turning together, diving together, surfacing simultaneously. Perfect synchronization born from perfect understanding. But something was different. Cheeto felt it even though he couldn't name it. Pocho's movements were gentle but somehow final. His usual playfulness was replaced with something else. Solemnity, perhaps, though Cheeto knew how dangerous it was to project human emotions onto a reptile. But the sense was undeniable. This felt like goodbye. They swam for longer than usual that morning. Pocho seemed unwilling to let the moment end, kept initiating one more circle around the pool, one more dive, one more embrace. And Cheeto followed, sensing that something important was happening even if he didn't understand what. Finally, Pocho swam to his favorite resting spot, the shallow corner, where he could lie partially submerged, and settled there. Cheeto sat at the pool's edge nearby, his feet in the water, his hand resting on Pocho's scarred head. They remained like that for hours, not speaking. Cheeto was silent for once, feeling that words would intrude on whatever was happening. Just being together, just present to each other. As afternoon approached, Cheeto finally stood, his body stiff from sitting so long. "I'll get your food," he told Pocho. The crocodile didn't respond, didn't move. Just watched Cheeto walk away with that single, ancient eye. When Cheeto returned 20 minutes later with Pocho's meal, he found his companion exactly where he'd left him. Still watching, still waiting. But something had changed. The water around Pocho was completely still. Too still. Cheeto felt his heart stutter. He called Pocho's name. No response. He called again, louder, fighting panic. Nothing. He dropped the food and ran to the pool's edge, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't realized were forming. Pocho was dead. Gone. Transitioned from presence to absence in the 20 minutes Cheeto had been away. As if he'd waited until Cheeto left, choosing to die alone, sparing his human companion the immediate trauma of witnessing the moment of death. Cheeto collapsed at the pool's edge, his hand reaching into the water to touch Pocho one final time. The massive body was still warm, still felt like Pocho, but the eye was empty now. The consciousness that had animated this creature, that had formed an impossible bond with a human, that had defied every principle of reptilian behavior for 23 years, it was gone. No. Cheeto heard himself saying, the word a prayer, a denial, a plea to whatever force might be listening. No, please, not yet. We were supposed to have more time. You were supposed to be okay. Please come back. Please. But Pocho didn't come back. Death is final in ways that love cannot overcome, and no amount of grief or pleading or desperate hope could restore the consciousness that had fled that reptilian body. Cheeto stayed by the pool for hours, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. Part of him kept expecting Pocho to suddenly surge back to life, to surface and rumble his greeting, to prove this was just a terrible mistake. But Pocho remained motionless. The water remained still. And gradually, horribly, Cheeto had to accept the truth. His son was dead, his companion of 23 years, the being who had understood him better than any human, the crocodile who had proven that bonds could exist across impossible divides. Gone. Neighbors found Cheeto hours later, still sitting by the pool, still touching Pocho's body, unable or unwilling to let go. They helped him stand, led him away gently, tried to offer comfort. But Cheeto was beyond comfort. He'd lost more than a pet, more than an animal he'd cared for. He'd lost his family, his purpose, the center of his world for over 2 decades. The news spread quickly, locally at first, then nationally, then internationally. Pocho the crocodile dies. Costa Rica's famous crocodile passes away. End of an impossible friendship. Headlines tried to capture the significance and failed. Because unless you'd witnessed Cheeto and Pocho together, unless you'd seen the genuine bond between them, unless you understood what they'd proven about consciousness and connection and the permeability of species boundaries, you couldn't truly grasp what had been lost. Cheeto arranged for Pocho to be preserved. Taxidermy, though the word seemed too clinical, too disconnected from the reality of what Pocho had been. A museum in Sequoias agreed to house Pocho's body, to create an exhibit explaining his story, ensuring that future generations would know about the crocodile who had loved a human and the human who had loved him back. The preparation of Pocho's body was agonizing for Cheeto. Watching strangers handle his companion's remains, measuring and preserving and treating Pocho like a specimen rather than a person. But Cheeto endured it because he wanted Pocho's story preserved, wanted people to know that this had happened, that for 23 years, a human and a crocodile had shared something real and profound and beautiful. When the preservation was complete, when Pocho's body was mounted in the museum, posed as if swimming, forever frozen in the movement that had defined his life with Cheeto. There was a public viewing. Hundreds of people came. Locals who had watched Cheeto and Pocho together for years. Tourists who had witnessed their performances. Scientists who had studied their bond. All coming to pay respects to a crocodile who had mattered. Cheeto spoke at the memorial, though he could barely get words out through his tears. "Pocho was my son," he said, his voice breaking. "I know some of you never believed that. Thought I was crazy or deluded. But it was true. He was my family. He chose me. He trusted me. He loved me. And I loved him with everything I had. For 23 years, we shared something that science said was impossible. We proved that bonds can exist in places we don't expect them. That consciousness and emotion and connection transcend species. That love can take forms we don't yet understand." He paused, looking at Pocho's preserved form, his hand reaching out to touch the familiar scarred head one last time. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay without him. I don't know how to live in a world where Pocho doesn't exist. But I'm grateful. Grateful for every day we had together. Grateful that he chose to spend his life with me. Grateful that I got to know him, to understand him, to be his family. He was the most real thing in my life, the most honest relationship I ever had. No pretense, no lies, just pure, uncomplicated companionship. And I will miss him every day for the rest of my life." The crowd was silent. Many were crying, because even those who had doubted, who had insisted the bond was projection or conditioning or coincidence, couldn't deny the genuine grief radiating from Cheeto, couldn't deny that what had been lost was real and profound and irreplaceable. After the memorial, Cheeto returned to his empty home, to the pool that was now just water, no longer animated by Pocho's presence, to the property that had been their shared world, now barren of the being who had given it meaning. He stood at the pool's edge, where he'd stood thousands of times before, but this time Pocho wouldn't surface to greet him, wouldn't make that soft rumble of recognition, wouldn't position himself for their daily swim. The water was empty, and Cheeto had never felt more alone. But even in his grief, even drowning in loss, Cheeto held on to something, gratitude, because he'd had 23 years with Pocho, 23 years of impossible connection, 23 years of being understood and accepted by a being who shouldn't have been capable of such things, 23 years of proving that the boundaries we assume exist between species are not as solid as we believe. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He would have wanted a lifetime more. But it was real. It had happened. And nothing, not death, not time, not the skepticism of scientists or the disbelief of observers, could take that away. Pocho had existed. Their bond had existed. And that would have to be enough. After Pocho's death, Cheeto tried to return to something resembling normal life. But normal didn't exist for him anymore. For over 2 decades, his entire world had revolved around a crocodile. His daily routines, his sense of purpose, his emotional center, all of it had been built around caring for and connecting with Pocho. Without him, Cheeto was unmoored, drifting without direction in a life that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. The pool remained empty. Cheeto couldn't bring himself to fill it in, to erase this space that had contained so much of what mattered to him. But he also couldn't bear to look at it. The water that had been the medium of their connection now just reminded him of absence. Every time he passed the pool, he expected to see Pocho's massive head break the surface, expected to hear that soft rumble of greeting. And every time, the water remained still and empty, and grief crashed over him anew. People suggested he get another crocodile. Well-meaning friends and neighbors who couldn't understand that Pocho wasn't replaceable. You couldn't just substitute one crocodile for another and recreate what had existed. The bond with Pocho had been specific, individual, built over 23 years of daily interaction. It was Pocho's personality, Pocho's choices, Pocho's unique consciousness that had made their relationship possible. Another crocodile would just be another crocodile. Not family. Not a son. Just an animal. But the deeper problem was that Cheeto wasn't sure he could survive forming and then losing another bond like that. The grief of losing Pocho was destroying him. He'd wake in the night, disoriented, believing for a moment that Pocho was still alive, still waiting in the pool. And then reality would crash back, and the loss would feel fresh and devastating all over again. How could he willingly open himself to that kind of pain again? How could he build another life around a creature with a limited lifespan, knowing that attachment inevitably led to this kind of agony? The scientific community, in the wake of Pocho's death, renewed their interest in analyzing what had happened between him and Cheeto. Papers were published. Theories proposed. Researchers debated the nature of the bond, the mechanisms that had enabled it, the implications for our understanding of animal consciousness. Most explanations remained stubbornly reductionist. Operant conditioning, habituation to human presence, the result of consistent food provision creating tolerance. These explanations could account for some aspects of Pocho's behavior, his acceptance of Cheeto's proximity, his willingness to tolerate handling. But they couldn't explain the specificity of the bond, the way Pocho refused interaction with anyone else. Couldn't explain the apparent emotional attunement, the way Pocho responded to Cheeto's moods. Couldn't explain that moment when Pocho spontaneously demonstrated trust by holding his jaws open while Cheeto's head was inside. A minority of researchers argued for something more complex. They suggested that Pocho had possessed a form of consciousness more sophisticated than traditionally attributed to reptiles, that crocodilians might be capable of individual recognition, emotional bonds, even rudimentary forms of empathy, that the boundary between higher and lower animals might be far more permeable than we've assumed. These researchers pointed to accumulating evidence from multiple species: ravens that could plan for the future, octopi that showed individual personalities and problem-solving abilities, fish that recognized human faces. The more we studied animal cognition without anthropocentric bias, the more we discovered forms of intelligence and awareness that didn't fit our neat categories. Maybe Pocho hadn't been an anomaly. Maybe he'd been normal, and our understanding of what crocodiles were capable of had been wrong. Maybe genuine bonds between humans and reptiles were possible, and Pocho and Cheeto had simply been the first to prove it publicly, dramatically, undeniably. But even among these more open-minded researchers, the question remained, why? Why had Pocho formed this bond with Cheeto specifically? Gratitude for being saved was too simple an explanation. Crocodiles weren't supposed to be capable of gratitude or remembering favors. Yet Pocho had not only remembered who saved him, but had returned to Cheeto after being released, choosing captivity with this human over freedom in the wild. Some suggested imprinting, that Pocho's near-death experience and subsequent recovery in Cheeto's care had created an imprint similar to what occurs in birds, causing Pocho to identify Cheeto as family. Others proposed that social deprivation, Pocho would have been isolated from other crocodiles during his recovery, made Cheeto his only source of companionship, creating an attachment born from necessity. But these explanations felt incomplete to Cheeto. They reduced what he'd experienced to biological mechanisms, as if understanding the process erased the meaning, as if explaining the neurochemistry of love makes love less real, as if knowing that attachment forms through oxytocin release and neural pathway development somehow invalidates the subjective experience of caring deeply for another being. The truth was, science might never fully explain what had existed between Cheeto and Pocho, because some things resist reduction. Some experiences can't be fully captured by analyzing component parts. You could study every neural pathway, measure every hormone, document every behavior, and still miss the essential thing, the lived reality of their connection. Cheeto knew what he'd experienced. He'd felt Pocho's presence, his awareness, his deliberate choices. He'd witnessed behaviors that suggested thought and emotion and individual personality. He'd lived daily with a being who appeared to understand him, to care about him, to choose to remain with him year after year. Was it love? By human definitions, maybe not. Crocodile neurochemistry and cognition were different enough from mammalian systems that assuming identical emotional experiences was probably anthropomorphic. But it was something real, something that mattered profoundly to both of them, and that something raised uncomfortable questions. If Pocho had possessed sufficient consciousness to form genuine attachment, to make deliberate choices, to experience something analogous to affection, what did that mean for how we treat crocodiles? What did it mean for how we treat all animals? If consciousness exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary, if it's not just human-level awareness versus instinct-driven automaton, then where do we draw the lines? Which animals deserve moral consideration? Which experiences matter? Which relationships are real? These questions haunted Cheeto. Because he'd crossed a boundary that most humans never cross. He'd formed a primary attachment to a creature outside his species. He'd built his life around a reptile, and now that reptile was gone, and Cheeto was left with grief as profound as any he'd felt for human losses. Did that mean something? Did it prove something? Or was he just a lonely man who had projected human meaning onto animal behavior, creating connection where none truly existed? Cheeto didn't know. Couldn't know. The uncertainty was part of the burden he carried. Because unlike scientific questions that can eventually be answered through enough research, the question of what existed between him and Pocho would never be definitively resolved. It lived in a space beyond proof, beyond objective verification, in the subjective realm of lived experience that resists external validation. But even if he could never prove it to others, even if scientists would forever debate and skeptics would forever dismiss, Cheeto knew his own truth. Pocho had been real. Their bond had been real. The love, or whatever the crocodile equivalent of love was, had been real. And he would carry that truth, along with his grief, for the rest of his life. You've stayed until the end. You've journeyed through a story that most people couldn't handle. A truth so strange and beautiful and heartbreaking that it challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between species, between consciousness, between love and instinct. That makes you rare. That makes you part of something important. Because what happened between Cheeto and Pocho wasn't just their story. It's a mirror reflecting back questions we desperately need to ask about our relationship with the natural world. We live in a time when most people have forgotten what it means to truly connect with animals, beyond the domesticated companions we've bred to need us. We visit zoos and see creatures behind glass, reduced to spectacles, their consciousness dismissed because acknowledging it would require us to reconsider the cages. We eat meat without contemplating the inner lives of those we consume. We destroy habitats while assuring ourselves that the animals displaced experience only instinct, not loss. Cheeto and Pocho force us to confront a different possibility. That consciousness exists in forms we don't recognize because we've systematically refused to look. That emotional depth, individual personality, capacity for attachment and memory and choice aren't limited to mammals with brains similar to ours. That a crocodile, a creature unchanged for 200 million years, operating on what we dismissively call primitive neural architecture, might be capable of recognizing kindness, choosing companionship, demonstrating love in its own reptilian way. If that's true, what else have we gotten wrong? How many animals have we misunderstood, dismissed, destroyed, because we couldn't recognize the consciousness looking back at us? How many connections remain unmade because we've decided in advance that they're impossible? Cheeto lived the answer to those questions. He paid for that knowledge with his marriage, his social connections, his conventional life. He spent 23 years proving that the boundaries we assume exist between species are permeable, that relationship can bloom in the strangest places, that family isn't limited to genetic similarity or shared biology. And what did he gain? Something that most people never find: absolute trust, unconditional acceptance, a bond free from the complications that plague human relationships, the lies, the expectations, the disappointments, the 1,000 ways we fail each other. Pocho couldn't lie, couldn't pretend, couldn't be anything other than exactly what he was. And in that honesty, that pure presence, Cheeto found something sacred. Was it worth the cost? The isolation, the grief, the years of being called crazy by a world that couldn't understand? Cheeto would say yes. Without hesitation. Yes. Because we don't measure the value of relationships by their social acceptability or their alignment with normal life. We measure them by their depth, their honesty, their capacity to make us feel truly seen. After Pocho died, Cheeto became an advocate for a different way of seeing animals. He would give talks, visit schools, share his story with anyone willing to listen. His message was always the same. Animals are not things. They are beings. They have inner lives we don't understand because we've never bothered to learn their language. They experience the world differently than we do, but not less deeply. And if we open ourselves to connection, if we approach them with patience and respect and genuine curiosity, we might discover that we're not as alone in consciousness as we believed. Some people heard him. changed how they thought about animals, began to question the casual cruelty embedded in our treatment of non-human creatures. But many dismissed him, insisted his experience with Pocho was an anomaly, a fluke, a case of anthropomorphic projection that proved nothing about animals in general. Cheeto didn't care about the skeptics anymore. He'd lived his truth. He'd experienced something real and profound, and nothing anyone said could take that away from him. In 2014, 3 years after Pocho's death, Cheeto adopted another crocodile. Not to replace Pocho, that was impossible, but because he'd learned something from 23 years with his reptilian son. He was capable of cross-species connection in ways most humans never discover. And there were other crocodiles out there, damaged, rejected, destined for death, who might benefit from what he'd learned. The new crocodile, whom Cheeto named Pocho Jr., was not the same as his predecessor, had a different personality, different preferences, different ways of communicating. Cheeto didn't try to recreate what he'd had with the original Pocho. That would have been disrespectful to both animals. Instead, he built a new relationship, appropriate to this new individual, learning Pocho Jr.'s language rather than imposing his old one. Would it become as deep as what he'd shared with Pocho? Cheeto didn't know. Might not live long enough to find out. He was aging too, his body worn from decades of physically demanding interaction with massive reptiles. But he tried, because what he discovered was too important to abandon. The possibility of connection was too valuable to let die with one extraordinary crocodile. Today, Pocho's preserved body remains in the museum in Sequoias, a testament to an impossible friendship. Thousands of people have visited, have stood before the mounted crocodile and tried to understand what it meant. Some see just a well-preserved specimen. Others see something more, evidence that the world is stranger and more miraculous than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Cheeto still visits regularly, still talks to Pocho as if his old companion could hear him. "I miss you," he says, his hand resting on the familiar scarred head. "Every day I miss you. But I'm grateful. So grateful. You changed my life. You changed how I understand what's possible. You were my family. You still are." Is he crazy? Maybe. Or maybe he's saner than most of us, because he understands something fundamental that modern society has forgotten. That companionship, loyalty, and love aren't limited to our own species. That the creatures we share this planet with are not resources or decorations or mechanical stimulus response machines. They are individuals. They have inner lives. They matter. And when we open ourselves to truly seeing them, truly connecting with them, we discover that we're capable of relationships that transcend every boundary we thought was fixed and permanent. That's Cheeto and Pocho's legacy. Not just one man's bond with one crocodile, but proof that such bonds are possible. That the world contains more mystery, more potential for connection, more ways of being family than we typically acknowledge. You've witnessed this story now. You've seen what's possible when someone looks at a dying crocodile and sees not a monster, but a being worth saving. When someone builds their entire life around that choice, despite every reasonable objection. When someone dares to cross the species divide and discovers on the other side something worth every sacrifice. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you dismiss it as an anomaly and return to seeing animals as lesser, as other, as fundamentally separate from human consciousness? Or will you let it crack open your assumptions? Will you look at the creatures around you, in zoos, in homes, in the wild, and wonder what consciousness might be looking back? What relationships might be possible if you approached with Cheeto's openness, Cheeto's patience, Cheeto's willingness to be changed by connection? The choice is yours. But choose carefully, because once you've seen what Cheeto and Pocho proved, you can't truly unsee it. Once you've acknowledged that a man and a crocodile can form a genuine bond, can love each other across the species divide, you have to reconsider every assumption about animals, consciousness, and the boundaries between different forms of awareness. This story changes people. That's why you're still here. That's why you read all the way to the end despite the difficulty, despite the grief, despite the uncomfortable questions it raises. Because deep down, you want to believe that the world contains more wonder than we usually acknowledge. That connection is possible in unexpected places. That we are not alone in our consciousness, our emotions, our capacity for attachment and loyalty and love. You were right to believe that. Cheeto and Pocho proved it. Now, in the comments, write this phrase: "This story changed how I see the human-animal bond." By doing so, you mark yourself as someone who doesn't flinch from difficult truths, someone who can hold complexity and grief and wonder simultaneously. You become part of a community of people who refuse to accept easy answers about consciousness, about animals, about what's possible when we open ourselves to genuine connection. Share this video. Send it to people who need to know that the world is stranger and more beautiful than conventional wisdom allows. Help Cheeto's message reach further. That animals matter, that their inner lives are real, that bonds can exist across seemingly impermeable boundaries. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Stories that disturb comfortable assumptions, that reveal hidden truths, that demonstrate the extraordinary possibilities lurking within ordinary reality. Because there are more stories out there. More examples of impossible connections. More proof that the world contains depths we've barely begun to explore. And watch the other videos on this channel. Continue your journey into the inexplicable, the mysterious, the truths that most people never dare to examine. Because once you've started asking these questions, once you've opened yourself to seeing past conventional boundaries, you can't stop. Nor should you. Cheeto is in his 70s now, still living in Sequoias, still caring for Pocho Jr., still sharing his story with anyone willing to listen, still insisting, against all the skepticism and scientific reduction and comfortable dismissals, that what he experienced was real. He's right, and now you know it too. Welcome to the community of people who see past the boundaries, who recognize consciousness in unexpected forms, who understand that love and connection and family aren't limited by species or biology or any of the categories we use to organize our understanding of the world. You've been changed by this story, whether you realize it yet or not. You'll look at animals differently now. You'll wonder about their inner lives. You'll question assumptions you once held without examination. That's good. That's exactly what should happen. Because the world needs more people like you. People willing to be disturbed, to be challenged, to be transformed by truths that don't fit comfortable narratives. Cheeto gave up everything to live that truth. The least we can do is carry it forward, to tell his story, to remember Pocho, to insist that what happened between them matters, means something, proves something important about the nature of consciousness and connection. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort, with grief, with wonder. Thank you for being part of this community of truth seekers. Now go. Take what you've learned here. Let it change you. Let it open your eyes to possibilities you never considered. The world is waiting to be seen differently, and you now have the vision to do so.